Okay, thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you, and glad that we have this opportunity to be together as we continue our study in the Proverbs. This is a study we began some time ago, and our ambition, I think, is simple but pure, and that is to let the Lord help us to be more wise. There's not an overabundance of wisdom in the world in which we live. Maybe there never has been, but certainly in our age, I think that's true. There's a lot of foolishness. And if we're honest with ourselves, I think we can find that there are many days in our own lives when we feel that the weight of that foolishness. So we let the Lord help us. We look to let the Lord direct us, to mold our thinking, to change the way we act and react. And I hope that you'll find this study to be useful. You may notice the arrangement's a bit different. This is an ongoing process. And as we try to make this teaching tool as effective as we can within the limits of the teacher. I've jokingly made the remark, I find the book of Proverbs challenging, but I find it less challenging than I do trying to deal with the tools of teaching. But there's some who have said that they found the charts that we had used previously in the class when we had it at the church building. They found them useful, and I'm glad to hear that. And so we offer them for whatever value they may be. But this is another program, another arrangement, and Brother Joel has been kind enough to try to drag me along, and so if this thing collapses in the middle, you can figure it's probably my fault. We'll try to regroup for next time, but we are looking to try to do the best we can. We're studying Proverbs. There's a non-biblical proverb, something about old dogs and new tricks, so we're working on that proverb too. But anyway, we do appreciate your patience and your interest in this study. We hope that you find it to be useful. I'm noticing in this particular arrangement, I don't see any way to get questions. We had a question box under the old arrangement, and now that's lost. We're developing this as we go. So, but obviously, we are glad you're here. And if you do have a question, we hope that you'll write it down and find a way to get it to us. Either talk to me when we meet, or if somebody who doesn't meet with us sees this and has a question, just email me or mail it to me. We'd be glad to do that, to get that from you. We do plan, Lord willing, to have this study on Tuesday nights, to do this live at 7 o'clock. There may be some occasions where we're not in town or able to do this, and so we'll try to let everybody know. But we do appreciate your finding this and your interest in this subject. We are moving into Proverbs 26, and these are, of course, the Proverbs that were collected by the men of Hezekiah. Back in chapter 25, we found that division, a new section of this great collection of wisdom, and we look forward to continuing in our study of this subject. Now, in verse 1, the old King James reads, "As snow in summer, and as rain in harvest, so honor is not seemly for a fool." We've seen some principles like this maybe hinted at in the Proverbs as well as in other places. But there's a comparison, a memorable comparison. He talks about snow in summer and rain in harvest, and how those things would be comparable to giving honor to one who is a fool. I always think it's worthwhile to just step back a moment and think about the words the Holy Spirit chooses here. And the word honor and the word fool, two words that don't really belong with each other. The word honor is a word which suggests the idea of weight. He's a weighty individual, someone who carries a certain we talk about gravitas, someone who carries a dignity, and perhaps someone given a place of dignity, someone who's given the benefit of reputation, the benefit of honor and an honorable position. Like, for example, Joseph. Over in Genesis 45, same word is used in reference to him and his place as he rose in Egypt. Job would lament, though he spoke these words when he was very low, about how that at one point in time he was considered a man of great honor, and he was. It's a wonderful thing, but to give honor and to give place to someone who is a fool, different story. The idea of a fool, this word literally means fat, which offends me a little bit, but it's talking about the idea of someone who is, it's not a pretty thing to say about a fellow, somebody's fat-headed. The British have an expression, I think they talk about a guy who's being thick as two short planks. It's not a compliment if they say that about you. And it's not so much a comment about your physique as it is your state of mind. Strong goes on to say someone who's stupid or silly, a dullard, a simpleton, an arrogant one. Brown Driver and Briggs add. And I think that's an important part of this. You know, we can talk about somebody being thick-headed. We don't always mean, or maybe even often mean by that here's someone of low IQ. Because frankly, it's not a sin to be of low IQ. You know, that's something that really we can't help. Now, we can try the best we can to dispel our ignorance within the limits of the ability we're given. But he's not so much here, in any way, condemning someone who is just not gifted. He is talking about someone, when they say they're thick-headed, we mean primarily somebody who's stubborn and arrogant. Ignorant and arrogant. That's a terrible combination. But they often go together. And that's the idea of the fool here. Kazil is the word. We see that a lot. The first, if you've read ahead, and I trust you have, in chapter 26, the first 12 verses in particular have a lot to say about the fool, and giving honor to the fool, place to the fool, the damage a fool can do. Actually, the whole book of Proverbs deals with foolishness contrasted with wisdom. So this is a very practical point. But Kazil is the word that he uses a lot in this section. And we'll come back to this word again and again. Here's someone who is thick-headed, stubborn, arrogant, ignorant, foolish, worthless and vain, another person described them as. And if you place a person who is this willingly, morally blind, someone who is given to rash action, someone who doesn't understand, doesn't want to understand, deals out of impulse, all of the things that make someone unwilling to listen, unwilling to take direction, that's exactly what Kazil comes back to. And that individual, if he's given a place of dignity, honor, and majesty, it's a disaster. It's just a disaster. Rain and harvest. This was an interesting little squib from Smith's Bible Dictionary, in which he explains, this would have been written back in the 19th century, but he points out that 6 months a year, you don't really have rain in Palestine. So the harvest is gathered without the anxiety which might trouble farmers in other places, unseasonable storms and such. So just like in Bible times, Boaz could sleep on his heap of corn. And in 1 Samuel 12, when thunder and rain was sent in wheat harvest, that was considered to be a miracle, a wonder. Harvest, brother Solomon could speak about the rain and harvest as being something very strange, out of place. Just like snow in summer, rain and harvest, something totally out of order. So it is that a fool would be given a place of honor. Bad people who have neither the wit nor the grace are sometimes preferred by princes and applauded and cried up by the people. And folly is set in great dignity, as Solomon observed in the 10th chapter of Ecclesiastes. You might read Ecclesiastes 10 In fact, there's a very similar point made there. Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 5 reads, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, as an error which proceeds from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, and the rich sit in low places." People who are unqualified are given positions of great dignity. We see that. We've seen that all through history. I imagine Solomon made some mistakes along that line. Maybe that's what he laments here, and perhaps he's seen it other places too. In our own country, we saw in not too distant a time, there was a woman who was appointed to a position of responsibility working in the White House under a particular president. And this woman had, I think her previous job had been on some type of game show or something. And come to find out that she was wearing a microphone during her daily work there, gathering information for the purpose of, as it turned out, she wanted to write a book after she got turned out. And she was hoping, I guess, somebody would say something terrible so she'd have a big seller on her hands. And you think, what kind of fox in the hen house is this? What kind of individual would do this? Well, you didn't find her out of the group of the best and brightest. When you find somebody who's sort of been a pretty disreputable individual, and then you put them in a position of trust, it wouldn't be too much of a surprise or shock to find out that maybe they're not up to that job. These things are just as relevant as today, is my point. This is still going on. And when people put their trust in and give a position to folks unworthy, it comes back to burn them. It's quite out of place to show respect to an ungodly man or raise him to a post of dignity. Such conduct will only confirm him to his folly, give others a wrong impression concerning him, and afford him with an increased power of mischief. Honor will only injure him. He will make unjust use of it, draw false conclusions from it, and will strengthen him in his folly and only increase it. So it's a good practical lesson there. At some point, we may be called upon to fill a position, to make a decision. Staff those that you have charge over with worthy people. Character matters. We talked about a dullard or a thickhead, so on. Truth of the matter is, you can have a person who may be brilliant as far as their IQ is concerned, but low in character, unwilling to listen, arrogant. This would fit the category not of the wise, but of the fool. That being the case, it'd be a great mistake. Totally out of place. As out of place as snow in the summertime, to give such an individual a position of authority, a position of honor. Okay, another lesson that we learn, figure out which button to push, goes back to verse 2. As the bird by wandering, as the swallow by flying, so the curse, causeless, shall not come. That's a little stilted in the translation, the King James translation. Others translate some of the modern speech translations this way: like a fluttering sparrow or a flying swallow, so an undeserved curse does not land. The Revised English Bible reads, like a fluttering sparrow or a darting swallow, groundless abuse gets nowhere. The word curse is a key word in that passage, obviously. What does that word mean? Well, it comes from a word which really means to make light of. We talked a while ago about heaviness, honor, giving gravity to a situation or an individual or a word. Well, here's the opposite of that. Here's someone who is light. And to treat others lightly, to treat them with contempt, even to vilify. This noun describes the general speaking of ill will against another. So, in one sense, a curse, well, we're all familiar with that. We've probably heard a few in our lifetime. Technically, a curse is the idea of to wish someone ill and to pronounce insulting and demeaning words on someone. But there's another sense in which a curse is associated with superstition, with a supernatural, supposedly metaphysical, supernatural curse. But one way to read this passage is to understand that if such curses are undeserved, they'll go nowhere. In the same way that those birds flutter about from one place to another, but they never really seem to land. They don't seem to have any full direction. So the idea is that empty curses, likewise, they never land. There have been certain times in the Scriptures when God would curse an individual. And I'll tell you, that fellow's cursed. Because the Lord is the judge, and his perfect knowledge and evaluation of a situation and his providential work will bring about the outcome that he expresses. He may use a man, he may reveal to an individual, as he did occasionally in the Old Testament, a blessing and a curse upon an individual, as the case might be. But apart from God and his will, well, the idea of a curse they're just words. Numbers 23 is on the screen there. That goes back to the story of Balaam, you remember. And Balaam was called a soothsayer. He's a mysterious character in many ways. He had obviously a knowledge of Jehovah, but he also was checkered background, I think it's fair to say. And when the Israelites began to move north, and they were heading not to take over Moab, but to go to the promised land, but the king of Moab at that time, a man named Balak, very concerned about Israel and about their numbers and their proximity to his land. So he went out and fetched out in the east. He went and fetched Balaam that he might come and curse Israel. You remember that story. It didn't work out the way the king intended, and maybe the way Balaam intended. He made the point early on in Numbers 23 and verse 8. He said, "How shall I curse whom God hath not cursed? How shall I defy whom God hath not defied?" That is the point. How can you curse the one that God has not cursed? The only power to curse or to bless ultimately comes from God. It reminds us the language is used, the same word, over in 1 Samuel 17. This is the story, you remember, of David and Goliath, one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament, when David, the most unlikely of champions, finds himself facing a fellow 9.5 foot tall, this monster of a man in single combat. And when David, in great faith, stepped forward to be Israel's champion, he had with him a shepherd's staff, and even unseen to the giant, that was all the giant could see. He also had a sling and 7 smooth stones he had picked up on the way, the stones at least. The giant, when he saw this young boy, unarmed, as far as he could tell, except for a stick, he thought, "You're mocking me." And so in verse 42 of 1 Samuel 17, when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. He was but a youth and ruddy and of fair countenance. And the Philistine said to David, "My dog, you come after me with a stick?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowl of the air, to the beast of the field." Well, that was the curse of Goliath. It was empty. It was groundless, and so went nowhere. It didn't have any power. He could express those words. And I think the great point of this practical aspect of this proverb is that point. We may There's some people actually who seem to be disturbed by superstition. It's a shame if people who have walked in the light of Christ would let that kind of darkness enter their life. Um, uh, Horoscopes and predictions by seers and necromancers and all kind of nonsense like that. People who are thinking wisely, not troubled by whatever these folks say. They're just talking nonsense. That's about as meaningful as a bird flying around from one place to another, not landing anywhere, no pattern that can be observed. Just meaningless, useless. And the same thing is true. We might be in situations where we are the victims of abusive language. And people curse others, maybe because that's the only way they know how to talk. That's a sad commentary on a person. And some people, that's just how they talk. It's just as natural as breathing. And the curses come quickly. And they are unpleasant to hear, and they're certainly unpleasant when they're directed at us. But I think this proverb is useful because it reminds us of how meaningless it is. They're just words. The old saying about names can never hurt. There's an aspect in which that's true. None of us enjoy being cursed at, cursed. But we understand how weightless it is and how meaningless it is in the true sense of the term. A malicious curse aimed at an innocent victim will fly harmlessly past its mark, Mr. Higgins said. It may flutter around the neighborhood, Mr. Clark said, but it won't take effect on an innocent person, the person against whom it was pronounced. Mr. Bridges adds, groundless fears are real evils and often press heavily on weak minds, but we need no more fear the undeserved curse than the birds flying over our heads. So, just a point to remember, that curses apart from the will of God have no weight whatever. Now, what God says is cursed is cursed. And behavior that the Lord identifies as cursed will be. But that's his power. Even Balaam found that out to be true. If he didn't know it at first, he certainly learned that fact. Okay, why don't we look at verse 3. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. That sounds pretty blunt, doesn't it? Some might find that to be disturbingly harsh or distasteful. But he's making a comparison, isn't he? Here are two animals, the horse and the donkey, as we would say. And the donkey actually was the animal that was more often ridden in the days that Solomon wrote this. And so, but you know what? Even an animal like that needs a bridle. A bridle has a way of directing that animal. You put a bit in his mouth and you're going to be able to turn his head. Where his head goes, most of the time he's going to go. The whip is even a harsher corrective measure that is sometimes used and has been used through the years on animals in order to teach them and direct them if they're stubborn. And what do we do if a human being who should be a creature of reason puts himself on the level of the animal? Corporal punishment, he said, may be the only option if all other measures fail. The idea of a rod is a broad word, and it really finds fulfillment in various places, whether it be literally a branch, a scion, or a stick that might be used for punishing or for riding or for fighting or for ruling or for walking, or the shaft of a weapon or a shepherd's implement. So that word is a very broad word, but it just carries the basic idea of a stick. We know what that is. And that might be shaped differently or of different weights or sizes for various purposes. But the idea goes back to corporal punishment. It's not the first time we've read about this kind of idea in the Proverbs, nor the last. Back in 10:13, on the lips of him who has understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him that lacks sense. Or in chapter 19, we saw this: condemnation is appropriate for mockers and just as beatings are for the backs of fools. The fool here, the chazil, again, the stubborn, obstinate individual who will not be brought under guidance or restraint from religion or from reason. What do you do with an individual like this? You can't reason with them. They're not going to hear counsel. They've made themselves into something more like animals, stubborn animals, in fact. And so force is the language that they will hear. If anything will reach them, it comes to this rather extreme measure. I want you to notice this before we dismiss this in horror. That the goal in each one of these cases is not intended to destroy, but rather to correct. You know, you're not trying to kill the horse or the donkey by using measures that are mentioned here. What you're trying to do is to take that strength and bring it under control. And sadly, certain individuals remove themselves from the realm of reason and rationality and bring upon themselves a punishment. As Mr. Phillips put it, the only way to get a fool to do what he's supposed to do, in this case, would be to use this punishment. Now, what lessons do we learn from this? Well, I think one lesson that is rather obvious is we ought to learn not to be a fool. You know, God forbid that we're that kind of people that are so stubborn that the only way we learn is from harsh consequences. People can't reason with us. They can't appeal to us in our higher nature. We've burned out our conscience to the point where the only thing that really comes into play is the question, you think I can get away with it? Now, when I get to that point, I'm the guy that the proverb here is talking about. I can only learn by being caught and being punished, and the punishment being so severe that I realize I don't ever want to do that again. There is a better way to learn. There is a better way to live, and it is by the conscience. Now, Proverbs 32 we have up here is a familiar passage to us. This is the passage that begins with the famous words, "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute iniquity, in whose spirit there is no guile." The Apostle Paul quotes from this passage in Romans famously as he describes the conditional grace of God. And what a wonderful blessing it is to be forgiven. That's what he means when he talks about the Lord not imputing our iniquity. The word impute, a word, we don't use that word anymore, but it's a word which really goes back to the idea of accounting. You mark down to somebody's account. But here's an individual, and the Lord has erased the account. They've been forgiven, in other words. Now, God does that through his mercy on his terms. And what David is writing about here is not somebody who has a license to sin. That'd be an awful way to misinterpret this passage. That he's suggesting you get to a point where God doesn't even count your sins anymore, in the sense that you can just sin and sin and sin, and he just lets it go. That's not taught anywhere in the Scripture. When he says here God does not impute to a man his sin, it means he has repented and been forgiven of his sin. And that's the point that David makes. When I kept silence, verse 3. And we know what David did. He did an awful thing. His sin was as grievous as we can imagine. Adultery, murder, the shedding of innocent blood, it was horrible. And David realized how horrible it was. And he couldn't live with that. He said, when I kept silence, my bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long. There was a groaning within. Day and night, thy hand was heavy upon me. David had a conscience. It weighed on him. It should have. He said, my moisture is turned to the drought of summer. My life became dry and dead. I could not put it out of my mind, not for long. But verse 5 describes David's response to the grace of God. I acknowledge my sin. Mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin. Well, it's a great psalm that reminds us of the marvelous, conditional, rich, powerful grace of God. Now he goes on to make this point, and we're getting to this, the latter part of the psalm now. For this shall every one that is godly pray unto thee in a time when thou mayest be found. Way too long. Surely in the floods of great waters they shall not come nigh unto it. Thou art my hiding place. Thou shalt preserve me from trouble. Thou shalt compass me about with songs of deliverance. Selah. Now verse 8. I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. God speaks to David then. And he speaks to all of us, I think, through this example. And he says, my mouth will teach you, my eye will be upon you. Verse 9, this reminds us of our proverb. Ye shall not be as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding. That word understanding, bene, suggests the idea of a mentality, a judgment, the ability to distinguish, the ability to discern. You know, animals don't have the same kind of discernment that God gave human beings. They're not of the same type. They share some things in common. We do. But man is not an animal. But man can act as a brute beast at times. But he says, God forbids that to be so. You will not be as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding. Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he that trusteth in the Lord, mercy shall compass him about. Be glad in the Lord, rejoice ye righteous, shout for joy, all ye that are upright in heart. What's the point? The point is, so much better to be led by the fear of the Lord, the love of the Lord, the will of the Lord, that conscience that moves us toward being more like him, seeking his grace. So much better to be guided by principle than to be guided by, I wonder if anybody's looking, am I going to get away with this? Some people can only be taught by a rod on their back. Now that's awful. It's foolish. And we're not made for that. We're better than that. And maturity and self-awareness, and as I said, a conscience that's not been destroyed will be a big help. So what's the lesson that we learn from this passage? Here's number one. Don't be a fool. Don't be the kind of person that will have to suffer and only learn by suffering. Let me add this too. I think another thing that I learned from this passage is that we ought not to object to the correction of the stubborn. We ought not to be, there's a curious kind of misguided delicacy, sympathy for criminals without a conscience. Now, I think we ought to be people of mercy, but it's amazing how we can work up tears for folks who are wicked and hardened in their wickedness, but not find much sympathy for those who may have suffered at their hand. It's not in anybody's best interest, including the criminal, to treat guilty people like innocent people. This makes no sense. To treat a fool as if he were wise, to ignore sin, ignore crime, and to remove any consequence. This does not help anybody. It doesn't help the innocent, it doesn't help the guilty. So I think this old proverb, though it was written 3,000 years ago, carries a truth with it that is certainly, I think, important for us to remember even today. Okay, I think we got time for another one. This is certainly one that we've run across before. The fourth verse reads, Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. And then verse 5, Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. What do we do with verses 4 and 5? I tell you, I've heard about as much about this passage from those who claim to be atheists or enemies of the Scripture as I have from reverent people trying to figure out what the teaching is. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the first place, if you think about this proverb and you think about these two pieces of instruction here, there are several words that they have in common. Answer a fool. Answer not a fool. According to his folly. Not according to his folly. The word answer simply means to respond, first to pay attention to, and then to respond, to speak back. It's the same word in both verses, where he tells us to and not to. The word fool, kazil, the same word we've been looking at, and it's the same in both these verses. The word folly is a word a little different than the words we've been looking at recently, but it's the idea of silliness, somebody who can't be serious, someone who is perverse, who's not looking for the way, but following the latest trend of their own whims. But this word is the same in both passages. So my point is, you don't find a difference to explain why he says in one verse, do this, don't do this, because different words are used here. So, is this a contradiction? Well, this would be one of the worst examples to try to put forward of a contradiction. If you're looking for a contradiction in a passage, you'd have to have someone especially unskilled. If they put two opposite thoughts back to back in the two sequential verses, this would be, ridiculous. I don't know how anyone, if you're looking for a problem from the Scriptures, whenever I see this on the list, I know right there I'm dealing with a guy who's really not thought this through or not been very honest. No, this is not a contradiction in Scriptures. You do have two seeming contradictions. There's a term, we talk about a paradox. He that saves his life shall lose it. He that loses his life for my sake shall find it. It's not a contradiction. It's a paradox. My favorite definition, I heard an old fellow one time, he said, a paradox is truth standing on its head to get attention. I like that. And I think that's right. I think that what we have here is truth standing on its head to get attention. We have a point made, or 2 points made here, very intentionally using similar language in order, I think, to bring our minds to the lessons to be learned. So what lessons do we learn? Two things that he makes at the point. He says, in the first place, there's a time when you ought not to answer a fool. That's the first thing he said. John Wesley once wrote, do not answer so as to imitate the folly of the fool by passionate or reproachful speeches. As I said, don't demean yourself. It would be the wrong thing to do. Wisdom would be opposed to getting into a shouting and screaming match, showing foolishness back to a fool. The ISV reads here, don't answer a fool according to his foolishness or you'll be just like him. And there's some great examples in the Scriptures that remind us of the need to avoid such behavior. The reference in 2 Kings 18 goes back to the time when Jerusalem was being threatened by the Assyrians during the days of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, and Sennacherib, who was threatening Israel, or Judah in particular, here Jerusalem. And he had sent one of his minions, his title was Rabshakeh, to come and to try to intimidate or bribe or whatever you might say, talk the city into surrender. And verse 33, hath any of the gods of the nations delivered at all his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Nobody can stand. Is anybody stood near the king of Assyria and swept through north and south? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad, the gods of Sepharvaim, or Hena, or Iva? Have they delivered Samaria out of mine hand? Samaria was the capital of the north, the northern half of Israel, and they had been taken already. And who are they among all the gods of the countries that hath delivered their country out of mine hand? That the Lord, Jehovah that is, should deliver Jerusalem out of mine hand. Made the classic mistake, the key mistake. He thought Jehovah was just like one of them. Big mistake. But verse 36 is my point. The people held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, answer him not. Hezekiah, and I think rightly so, told the people, don't get an argument with this fellow. Don't say anything. The truth is not going to be helped by answering this guy. In the 23rd chapter of Luke, the setting here is of the Lord. He was being tried. And you remember how that at one point he had several trials, I think we could say. At one point he was called to answer before Herod, who was visiting in town. Pilate sent him over there. And Luke 23 and verse 8 says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, because he was desirous to see him of a long season, and because he heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. And he questioned him with many words, and he answered him nothing. The Lord thought it best here to be silent. His enemies were yapping like little dogs, but he said not a word. And the Lord sometimes teaches us to do the same thing. Matthew 7 has been an intriguing passage, I guess, since I've started trying to read the Scriptures. This is the passage that on the one hand, in the Sermon on the Mount, the part that tells us not to judge harshly or unrighteously others. But then in verse 6, we find the Lord in the same context saying, give not that which is holy unto dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you. Dogs and hogs, as somebody said. And there's some people that are like that. They're like dogs and hogs. The Lord said that. I didn't say that. How do you know? Well, I don't think you can just look across a room or across the street at somebody and tell. There are people who may have very peculiar appearances that may be actually people soft-hearted looking for the gospel. There may be folks who look very fine and dignified that may be devils in a sense. So it's not by just appearance. But you find out, people let you know. And I think the Lord's point is not that we're supposed to be really good guessers. The point is, if you, in dealing with someone, find that they have no interest, they are hardened fools, then there's no way you can force them. And the more you do, the worse it gets. And so there's a time when you don't answer a fool according to his father. There's a time not to answer. And that's what the wise man said. On the other hand, there's a time when you ought to answer. You answer, what does the text say here? In verse 5, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. His own conceits. The word goes back to the idea of a fountain. It's a figure for the center of our attention, the center of things, the eye. And then by extension, it came to be a word used for an avenue of temptation. Job in the 31st chapter offers to bring himself under a curse if he has actually been a secret sinner, a wicked man. Then he says, I don't object to suffering. In Job 31 and verse 7, if my steps have turned out of the way, and my heart walked after mine eyes, if any blot had cleaved to my hands, then let me be punished. My point is, if my heart hath walked after mine eyes, it's the same idea, after his own conceit. If he has walked according to his way, Judges 17, that's the great epitaph of that era. There was no judge in Israel, no king in Israel, I should say, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And so it said here, this expression, his own conceits. Here's a person who in his own eyes is so proud and arrogant that he considers himself to be his own law. Now, there may be a time when, as Mr. Aiken said, if you don't speak up, the fool's conceit will go unchecked. Worse, it may influence other people. There may be a time when something has to be said. You have to answer in order to save the other person. I think there's a case of that in 2 Corinthians 11, and we'll not take time to go through this in any detail, but you remember that there were enemies that Paul had at Corinth. You know, Paul, an apostle of the Lord, true as could be, honest as could be, sacrificial in his service, and folks had come along after Paul at Corinth and convinced the Corinthians Paul was not a good guy and that they were the ones to listen to. It wasn't an ego thing with Paul. He was an apostle of the Lord. If somebody is leading people away from his word, they're leading them away from Christ. So he had to speak. And these people were seemingly boasting and posturing and pretending, posing as if they were some great servants of God. And Paul in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 17 writes, "That which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly, in this confidence of boasting." What does it mean by that? I like some of the modern speech translations there. One reads, "In this self-confident boasting, I am not talking as the Lord would, but as a fool." And what he goes on to do is to point out how that if they glory in the flesh and in all their accomplishments, if we got on that level, there's no way they could keep up with me. And that's where he talks about how they Hebrews, not like I am. Are they ministers of Christ? They servants of Jesus? You want to compare scars with Paul? In labors above, more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more often, in deaths frequently. 5 times the Jews when he was down 40 stripes, save one. And he goes through that long list of all the sacrifices he had made. He says, you forced me to speak as a fool. Here's an example of answering a fool according to his folly. Why would he do that? Normally, it's not the way Paul would he wouldn't go up to everybody that he met and say, "Now, look at this long list of things that I've done." He was doing that to try to save the Corinthians from destroying themselves, from following after these imposters. In 12:11, after more along that same line, not only of suffering but of the revelations he had seen, he says, "I am become a fool in glorying. Ye have compelled me." There may be times when we're compelled to answer a fool's folly. I like what Mr. Bridges wrote a long time ago about this. He said, "Oh, for the wisdom to govern the tongue, to discover the right time to speak and the right time to stay silent." Ain't it so? So this is not a contradiction. It's pointing out the fact that the issue is complicated and that it's going to take discernment and wisdom to know. There's sometimes it just doesn't deserve an answer. There are other times when the truth might suffer and we're called on to answer. And I think all of us will find that distinction to be a challenge. But a wise person is constantly looking at those two questions. What will best serve not my ego that's been wounded by this fellow or whatever else, but the cause of truth? That's what we've got to decide. Okay, you've listened very patiently. Thank you so much for being with us today. We hope, Lord willing, to be with you again in this format next Tuesday. And if you have comments or questions, points of improvement that you want to share with me, please feel free to do that. And we'll try to incorporate those things. Thanks so much for being with us.